Welcome, everyone, to episode 96 of Puppet Masters and Castle Freaks, the internet's leading all things Charles Band podcast. I am one of your hosts, Jarrod Hornbeck, and I'm coming to you, as always, from Brooklyn, New York. But no, I am not here alone. I mean, I'm rarely ever here alone, and today's no different from that. So who is that sitting across from me right now?
Well, by across from you, you mean across the country in Austin, Texas. It's me, Steve Guntley, and this is the podcast about... Wait, I don't have any weird copy today. Why is that? Why don't I have any weird copy about a specific movie today?
Well, I thought that this would be kind of a fun thing to do, Steve, and I accosted you into doing this without telling you beforehand what it was. So I hope that you agree to it, begrudgingly or otherwise.
Sure.
So, one of the pieces of feedback that we got on the show is people have been really happy with the guests that we've had on the show. They've enjoyed hearing stories of, people like Jeffrey Byron, people like Dave Parker, Ted Nicolau, and such, talking about specific experiences making a lot of these movies that we've been covering on the show.
Yeah.
That aspect of it has been incredibly positive. One thing, I wouldn't say this is a piece of negative feedback, more constructive than anything, that I've gotten has been that because we sort of got started so early with guests on the show and started booking full moon people and people connected to some of the properties so early on, we cast out our net for guests and people were just responding. They were down. They wanted to do it. We ended up booking pretty far in advance to the point where we still tend to record these episodes pretty far in advance, and some people have voiced that they feel like maybe we didn't spend enough time with just us doing these shows. Like, when you listen to a podcast, and I listen to certainly some shows where it's just one or two or potentially maybe three hosts who week to week get together, there's kind of a communal hangout sense to it.
Absolutely,
and I think when we got the show started, I definitely think, we were talking about the movies, but there was kind of a feeling more of like, it was me and you hanging out, saying how we feel about these movies, giving our origin stories about how we came to Full Moon and Empire and how we came to horror movies and our relationship with that. But really, as we've done these shows, and it's been an honor actually to have some of the people on, and it's been so fun recording them.
Yeah.
We've definitely spent less time sort of just hanging out, sort of living with like just the two of us talking. I know in the very beginning, we thought about having segments about things that we were like drinking or things we were excited about or things we wanted to kind of promote. And those kind of got thrown by the wayside because we all of a sudden were booking all these really important and amazing guests.
And the structure of the show kind of evolved to be more of like, it's a little bit of a historical podcast that in a degree, it's a bit of a kind of a deep dive sort of podcast in a lot of ways. So it kind of shifted away from that. But I think, this is basically going to be kind of a loose sort of getting to know your hosts. Nearly 100 episodes in, it's about time you guys should get to know us. And I think, there are some degrees of like our personal biographies that have come across over the episodes, over the last year and change that we've been doing this, so like there's some things that people have gleaned together. But if you're just jumping into the show and don't really know who the hell we are, like it might be, I think it's a good idea to just kind of let people know who we are.
No, you're totally right, Steve. And we have this very sort of like, we have a certain type of hubris, I think, where we assume everyone's been with us since day one.
No, of course.
And it's,
why wouldn't they be?
Exactly. And so we, in day one, we kind of gave our little backstory and we talked about our taste in certain kind of movies and what we gravitate towards and this and that, and introduced ourselves. And I think our personalities came out a little bit in those first few episodes, but really by episode like 8 or 9 of the show, we started getting regular guests and that never stopped. For
which
essentially almost 90 episodes now of just guests after guests after guests. I think we had one straggler in there. We did like the episode on Lurking Fear
Oh yeah,
after we
yeah.
had done a few guests, and then we went right back to guests the following week. And so,
There are
uh,
definitely more. I mean, it is far, far, far more with guests than without. Almost entirely with, which is like, yeah, and given that amazing spate of guests that we've had, I mean, this might be a good place to jump into it. I think people might be surprised to learn that neither of us work in horror or film professionally. Like, not really. I think we're both kind of on the periphery of it a bit, but like, that's not like either of our main jobs. Like we don't really. So many of the people that we have on are like filmmakers or writers or critics or things like that in the horror
absolutely.
sphere. And weirdly, we don't do that. So it's kind of a passion, it's kind of a hobby, but we're also sort of like tangentially related to entertainment businesses in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I mean, I've especially in the about 10 years ago, I worked as an AP on a short, and that short got made, didn't do a whole lot. And then I really didn't work in film at all for a long time, was just a fan, someone who studied film. I was a student of film in a lot of ways. It consumed as much content as I could, but wasn't really working within it. And it wasn't until a few years ago that I started really hanging out or hanging around a group of local filmmakers and made a bunch of new friends and really broadened my sphere of people that I was hanging out with. And through that group of people, I started to get kind of involved again. So I did recently produce a short film, which is in post production now. Um, Probably still in post production when this airs. Again, we record these things a little bit in advance. Hopefully looking for like a sometime in the first 3 month, 4 months or so of 2025 for it to be completed.
Yeah.
So more information on that to come. But that was amazing because I the short I worked on a long time ago, we had a professional DP. We had my best friend essentially was one of the directors, co-directed it with a friend of his, and we had some crew of people that they knew, and it was very guerrilla filmmaking in terms of like a little bit of equipment. We'll go shoot here without permits, get the shots where we can get them type thing.
Yeah.
This experience was really fun because the crew that worked on this movie were a lot of people who've worked on films that have been in local festivals recently, and also they've worked for Trauma a bit too. So it was kind of nice to be part of a crew in some way, who were, all established people, legitimate industry people in that way. And that's only really something that's changed for me recently. But you're
Yeah.
totally right, Steve. Like, I think somebody listening to this podcast, they hear us talk about connections to things. No, I mean, I am an elementary school teacher by
Yeah.
trade. Like, my master's is in childhood education. I am in my 11th year teaching. I've fluctuated what grades I teach. Currently, I'm teaching fourth grade, but I've taught anywhere between first grade and fourth grade.
Amazing.
I don't like first grade. They're they're
What did
like
they do to you?
they're very no, they're just like babies. Like
Yeah.
I'm not nurturing enough to third grade and fourth grade are really, really fun. The curriculum is very interesting. They're really easy to indoctrinate. No, I'm just kidding. They're
They are
they're
sponges at that age. That must be the most fun time to be a teacher, because you can really see them like absorbing some of these concepts and still getting excited about some of these concepts.
yeah, no, they're excited. They're happy to see you every day, and they want to learn, they want to move forward with the work. They don't really have a chip on their shoulder about school at that age. They're with it enough to be a little sarcastic and a little snippy and clever, which I can
Mhm.
appreciate, and they can understand it too if you kind of give it back to them a little bit. Um, it's a really fun age, and I like the third and fourth grade curriculum a lot. So I'm those are the two that I kind of bounce back and forth between the most, the two that I've taught the most. Um, but yeah, no, I mean it's been an amazingly rewarding career, but it's so night and day from the stuff that I do as hobbies. So I'll work my normal work week, my work day, my school year, whatever it is. And then in my downtime, whether it's summer break, whether it's holiday breaks, things like that, I go to a lot of horror trivias. I go to some conventions. I go to events put on by collectives of people in New York locally. And that's just been a great way. So it's like all of these kind of peripheral people get together. And I've been a part of that community, even if I haven't been like a true filmmaker proper in that way. And
Yeah.
and that's really also a big passion of mine. I hope one thing I hope comes across in this show is that when you listen to the show, like the simplest way you can that I've heard like family members try to describe this to someone, like if my mom is having a conversation, it's like, oh, my son has a podcast. I say, oh,
Yeah.
what's it about? Well, she's not going to say Charles Band because then she's going to be met
She
with
doesn't know
crickets.
who that is. Yeah.
So she'll say like it's a horror movie podcast,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
most of the time it is, but
Yeah.
at times it's not. I mean, we cover softcore and moonbeam stuff, and we're not always talking about horror, but I think horror is very present in the
That's our bread
DNA
and
of it.
butter. Yeah. Yeah.
And I hope that people listening to the show recognize that, like, outside of the world of Full Moon or Empire, that when it comes to just like other horror stuff, like we kind of like we know our stuff, you know?
Do now. I'm curious. I don't know if people are curious about how we know our stuff. I don't know. That's kind of a long and complicated answer. I think both of us just kind of have the predisposition to retain facts, especially about things that interest us. At least that's the case with me. Like,
Yep.
I am definitely the type who will forget birthdays and phone numbers and things like that, but I will remember what year obscure movie X came out and who directed it and who wrote it. So like my girlfriend calls it IMD brain. So I've got a
Oh,
little
that's
bit of
good.
that going on, like,
Uh,
and I think you've got a touch of that as well. It
I
makes it
certainly do. I
makes
will
it
forget
very good at
to,
trivia. Yeah.
yeah, I'll forget to mail my mom a card on Mother's Day, but I'll be the first person to tell you that Shelley from Friday the 13th 3 was played by a man named Larry Zerner.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The big Z himself. Yeah, as we call him. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I will also know that Shelley is my least favorite character in the entire
I
Friday the
think that's
13th
why he popped into my
franchise.
head.
And
'Cause
it's
I
not
was like,
it's not a knock against the Big Z. I think the performance is effective. I think he is performing the character as written, and that's the problem for me. But I digress. Yeah, I think.
well, that's
Oh, go
another
ahead.
thing though, Steve, is like so we're talking, I'm talking about how I've been, involved in these small projects from a behind the camera producer standpoint, and you're talking about Shelley, you know, performing the part as it's written. So you don't often, I mean, I like to think that I'm sometimes an okay improv partner, scene partner.
You are
I'm
absolutely
not trained in that. So
right.
I leave my participles dangling and my yes ends on the floor.
Do it.
But
Do it.
but the thing is, like, you have this whole other thing too that you're pursuing. So like,
Yeah.
as long as I've known you, you've had this acting on the side thing going on too. So like,
Yeah.
how did you get involved in that? And then is that what you consider also then to be your profession?
Right. Yeah. I mean, at this point, no, acting is definitely not my profession. I have been making a push mostly in this last year to go a little bit more pro, and try and get some paid gigs. I booked a commercial locally here, and I've been doing a lot of theater gigs and things like that, but nothing really yet. But I have been performing since I was probably in third grade. Lots and lots of live theater. And recently, since moving to Austin about 3 years ago, I have been really immersing myself in the comedy community here. So lots of improv, a little bit of stand-up, although I'm very terrible at stand-up. I need to refine my bit a little bit, but lots of improv. I'm in a sketch troupe here called The Floor is Lava, where we write and stage our own sketch show and do one every single month. And then I really took to improv. It's that's been a really rewarding journey for me so far. I mean, but my day job in terms of that is I'm actually a journalist, and that's That's what my degree is in. I haven't actually been working in journalism my entire career. I took a long, like about a 10-year gap in there where I was more in the private sector, but I am now back in journalism. I'm an editor
I've
of a
heard they
small
expect
paper.
results.
Yes. So yeah, they expect results. Yeah. I think our dispositions are reflected, even if people are surprised that we're not really in horror. I think they can tell that you are much more patient than I am. And I've constantly got like 100 million things going on in my mind because I overbook myself to a ridiculous degree. So I think that's coming across at least a little bit. You definitely have more of a school teacher mannerism when dealing with a lot of my ADHD nonsense. So I think that comes across, even if people can't tell exactly what we do.
Well, after dealing with 9-year-olds all day, what you're probably fixating on and considering ADHD mannerisms seem very well adjusted to me and very easy to deal with. So
that's good that I'm of a caliber with average 9-year-olds. Well, what else should we dig into here? I guess we've talked about like what our first horror movies were. We definitely have talked a lot about the video store kid experience. Like, yeah, I think it was slightly different environments for both of us because you're born and bred New York City. And so you've always kind of had quick and ready access to video stores, to things like that.
I thought you were going to say quick and ready accent.
The quick and ready accent.
I worked a long time to get rid of that accent.
I really no accent that's noticeable.
No, so I was born in the Bronx. I didn't really live in the Bronx. Actually, when I was really little, after being born in the Bronx, we lived in Westchester County, which is directly north of the Bronx. It's actually like bordering New York City, but not technically New York City.
Oh, right, yeah.
And then I moved to Queens when I was a kid. And when I lived in Queens I lived in the neighborhood of Woodhaven, which is a very working class neighborhood.
Yeah.
It's right over the eastern Brooklyn border. It's far out there. Like if you're looking at a map of New York City and you're kind of judging, where you want to be based on proximity to Manhattan. I mean, it's a trip. Like it's a ways out there. The J train, the J and the Z train are on elevated tracks that go out through Brownsville, East New York, Cypress Hills, Woodhaven, Jamaica, and Jamaica Avenue is the main thoroughfare. And so I lived right right off of Jamaica Avenue, right under the elevated subway tracks, and it was a cool little neighborhood to live in because it was really self-sufficient in a lot of ways. I mean, you had we had a public library, which was about 4 or 5 blocks away, which I liked to go to. My elementary school was a short walk. We had stores, grocery stores, a comic book store, toy store, a video store, which I've talked about many times. And, it was kind of great for that. I know that I'm looking at things a bit with rose-colored glasses in the sense that this is a time when New York City wasn't the best.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I have
the Ninja Turtles 1 era, as we've described it many times. Yes.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly really when this
That's how everybody thinks of it every time.
Yeah. And so, we eventually moved when I was an adolescent to the suburbs. And I lived there for a while, and I went to high school and college and stuff in the suburbs, and then I ended up moving back to the city and staying in the city since then. So there was a good chunk of time where I was out of the city, but close enough, like a kind of a stone's throw away.
Okay. Okay.
But I've, the city has informed a lot about me to the point where I have a real nostalgia for any movies that are set in sort of gritty 1970s, 80s New York. That's just
it's
an
why
aesthetic.
You're the world's greatest defender of New York Ripper.
Oh yes,
yeah.
Please.
That's on your gravestone.
If you take nothing away from this interview that Steve is doing with me, it's that I champion everything in the New York Ripper. There is not one problematic element in that movie, and you can quote me on that.
You tacitly endorse all of it. Yep, exactly.
Please don't do that. I like Fulci, but I draw the line with like recommending the New York Ripper because it's pretty heinous.
That's
Although
a
I
hard
do
one.
have the soundtrack on vinyl, so I guess maybe I am sort of supporting it in an offhanded kind of way, but I
Yeah.
don't support most of what happens on screen in that film. But no,
Yeah.
I just feel like it was nice to have things around me. I think when I mentioned this in an episode you will have heard maybe a month or two ago for transmutations, where I was saying how the first Halloween scared me because I had moved to the suburbs, and it
Mm.
finally was like, oh, I live in a cul-de-sac now, and there's one street light, and it's insanely dark when I look out the window, and like my parents may not have locked the doors, and an intruder can just walk into the house now, so that informed me a bit too. But I'm just, I think about some of these things we've talked about or made comments to on Mike, like these sort of New York institutions that may not still exist,
Yeah.
like a Kim's Video or CB's or something like that. I'm really just thankful to have been able to be old enough to be consuming media, going to shows, stuff like that. That's another thing I didn't really mention is like music is a huge part of my life. My music taste is incredibly varied,
Mm.
but really if I have to really hone it down to describe it to someone, I grew up in a household that was my parents were really into they were into punk in the 70s,
Oh yeah.
but then they were also very into like post-punk and new wave.
Oh, okay.
So when I was a kid in the house, they were always playing like The Clash or Elvis Costello or Joe Jackson or Squeeze or XTC, bands like that was really kind of the soundtrack that was on. And my parents are both very musical people. And so it was just, you couldn't escape it in my
Yeah.
household. And that really informed the kind of music that I was into. And I also I like everything to some degree. But I really also like, hardcore punk and like thrash and speed metal and stuff like that too.
Yeah.
But I also will put on like a yacht rock Spotify playlist
Yeah, I was gonna say
or
you're the biggest Peter Gabriel fan I know.
I
Like,
am, and that's
yeah.
my dad was a big Peter Gabriel era Genesis fan.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I liked Peter Gabriel as a kid. I mean, I remember seeing the Sledgehammer video or Shock the Monkey video and
Yeah.
ones
Yeah.
like that. And he was always so avant-garde and so weird. The videos were always so memorable. Um, but then once I started to really dive into his catalog of stuff, as I don't know, maybe like 18 years old, I
Oh yeah.
really did a deep dive. He became one of my absolute favorites.
I
I'm
mean,
more or less
so is a
obsessed with.
perfect album. Yeah. Yeah. I've listened to that one a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, so like these kinds of things, I mean, this aspect, like I feel like punk and kind of metal or rock and roll culture, for lack of a better word, really also informed. That's the other thing too, is like for nobody really who's listening to this podcast who knows me only as the host of this podcast has ever just seen me on the street.
Right.
Like I'm generally wearing a band t-shirt or a horror movie t-shirt. If it's the fall or the spring, I probably have a biker jacket on,
Yeah.
a pair of jeans, and Converse All Stars. I'm dressed like a Ramon.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
basically, And so my friends know me. They know that's a big part of my life. But to a lot of people listening to this, I'm probably a stranger or just an internet personality.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, the Ramones are maybe my favorite band. I listen to them. I think they're always Ramones and Bad Religion are always 1 and 2 on my Spotify Wrapped every
Okay.
year.
Okay.
So
Ramones are top 5 for me for sure. Yeah. I think I might go Tom Waits as number 1, but yeah, but that fluctuates all the time. I do love Tom Waits. Yeah.
well, Tom Waits is a guy who has, a really rabid fan base. Similar to Tom Waits, someone who I really, really love is I love Nick Cave.
I love Nick Cave. Yeah, Nick Cave's incredible.
Yeah, so Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, or every once in a while I'll go back and listen to like a Leonard Cohen album
Yeah.
too when I'm feeling very mopey. Um, but so Steve, like I'm very interested because our conversations generally deal with movies and stuff like that. So
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
where does your like, what's your kind of the musical journey?
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is how many musicals have you performed in?
I could answer
No.
that actually. 6? Yeah, something like that. Yeah. So I've done a few. But musical tastes weirdly do not run to usually to show tunes in my own spare time, but I've performed many of them. No, I definitely had like a rather embarrassing new metal phase in high school,
Sure.
which I shed myself of most of that, but that did lead me to punk music, and so I had a real punk phase in in high school as well, which I still have a lot of affection and endearment for, even though I've broadened my palette quite a bit. But I did listen to a lot of punk. I've been to a lot of punk shows, and that was definitely a big part of my life for a long time. Weirdly, the older I get, the more into hip hop I am. I've been
Sure.
really into hip hop the last couple of years, especially going back to like early 90s stuff that like missed me because I wasn't allowed to listen to it as a young child, even though it's stuff like, you know, my favorite hip hop group is a Tribe Called Quest, and they are not like a super hardcore, like angry, scary hip hop group, but I still was not allowed to listen to them when I was younger. But yeah,
No,
I got
you did not discover the low end theory until you were much older.
I did. That's very true. And now it is genuinely one of my like top 10 favorite
Oh yeah,
albums. Yeah.
Tribe is amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
and the funny thing is, like, I said a lot of stuff that was sort of like Anglo-centric in
Yeah.
terms of like, oh, you know, these artists, a lot of them are from Britain. That's kind of where like the stuff my parents were listening to most was coming from. But I mean, MTV was a huge influence on me too, to
Oh
where I was
yeah.
watching, you know, in the late 80s. And I love hip hop from like 1986 to like 1994.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
I can throw one of the first 3 or 4 Beastie Boys albums on at any time.
Mm-hmm.
I loved I from when I was a kid, I absolutely loved LL Cool J.
Oh my God.
He was a Queens guy too.
Radio is an incredible
Can't live
album.
without my radio.
Yeah. Mama Said Knock You Out, that whole early. I mean, and people don't realize, like, when you're hearing those songs, that's LL at like, what is he, like 15 years old,
I
16?
think radio, he's like 15 or 16
He's a
because I think
baby. Yeah.
the one that I had, I think radio was maybe slightly too early for me. I was just still too young, but it really broke for me with Bigger and Deafer, which I
Yeah.
think is his second album, and that's the I'm Bad is the
Yeah.
first
Yeah.
song, which
Yeah.
is the first song where he ever proclaims that his hat is like a shark's fin, by the way. It is. No, it is.
I didn't know that.
Actually
That's
says that
amazing.
line in that song.
Oh,
Um,
such a I love that so much.
but
Yeah, yeah.
that was a huge one for me, and that sort of it was the combination of like him being like in really good shape, but
Hmm.
like his sort of like tracksuit and Kangol hat like look. I just really gravitated toward that. I mean, I did, you know, I had the embarrassing time where, you know, obviously I was pumping Vanilla Ices to the extreme for a
Look,
little while.
we all had our phases. The first hip hop album my parents let us own was Gangsta's Paradise by Coolio. So like I can't really say, you know, that I have like hardcore bona fides or anything, but like I've been coming to appreciate it more and more as I get older. And like, you know, and generally I think when you're younger, you do tend to, I don't know if that happens anymore, but at least for me, for our generation, like you would pit musical genres against each other, right? Like if
Hmm.
you're into if you're into metal, you don't listen to rap music. If you're into rap music, you don't listen to country. And now it's all kind of a melange, you know, like pretty much every rap artist has a country album on the charts this year.
Can I
Like,
interest you in the Judgment Night soundtrack?
exactly, you can, and I will. Yeah, that was
Yeah.
definitely. I think, you know, being primarily movie kids growing up. I don't know if this was your experience, but like most of my musical taste was kind of shaped by soundtracks. like I would get those little samplings, right? Like you would get like the filmmaker basically curates your musical taste for you, and you can kind of take and choose like what you like out of it. So, you know, you'll learn who like David Bowie is through a movie soundtrack or something like that.
I'm gonna address that point in a second. I do just want to say that as a New Yorker, though, it was very cannot be overstated just how important like both the I guess slightly before the rise of Biggie Smalls was Wu-Tang, and then all of the subsequent solo Wu-Tang,
which
like
somehow
36 chambers.
Yeah.
I must have skateboarded the parking lots of the banks to 36 chambers, and then to like the Jizza's album, or to Cal, or the dirty version, or only built for Cuban links. That's the best one.
Yeah.
So those, and then probably that one of the albums I played the most when I was about 14 or so was Nas Illmatic.
Still one of my favorites. That was when I started building out my vinyl collection, which I think we've both gone on about our vinyl collections. We have we're big nerds about that. But I think Nas was that Illmatic album, I think, was the first one I bought. Like, I think I was kind of inspired to buy the record player because I saw Illmatic at a discount store. I'm like, yeah, oh hell yeah, obviously I need to have this on vinyl. It's interesting too. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Steve.
Oh yeah, it's just funny that, like, you know, we kind of had similar experiences, like growing up and absorbing pop culture, even though like the upbringing itself could not be further apart. Like, literally, I was on the opposite coast, you know.
This is pre-Austin. So where were you?
Pre-Austin. So I bounced around like quite a bit. You've mostly been in like New York or like the surrounding areas, and I bounced around a decent amount. So born in California, first like 8 or 9 years of my life was there. Then we moved to Colorado in the early 90s. That's where most of my life was. Like, the good 20-year chunk of my life was in Colorado. Then I moved to Washington State, where I was living when we first started podcasting together for Talking Terrific Television. And then about 2.5 years ago, I moved to Austin, Texas. So I definitely bounced around a lot. But most of that upbringing, especially the Colorado chunk, I was in the woods, and I'm not exaggerating. I was living in a cabin in the woods on a miniature horse ranch. And this sound, people think I'm making this up every time. My parents still have some.
Was it Fenton's Horse Ranch?
That's exactly right. They were very specifically engineered to.
You weren't having fun anymore, so you had to go there.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I grew up on this weird, like, my parents just had this weird, they grew up in cities and they always wanted to live out in the mountains. And so they moved the whole family out to a cabin in the woods. And I had a 3-hour bus ride to get to school, like twice a day. Like, I had to go, it was 3 hours there, 3 hours back. I was getting up like before the crack of dawn. And
good Lord,
like, video stores, video rentals were kind of my one great, like, treat, you know, because the nearest movie theater was like 3 hours away. I think I saw fewer than 10 movies in theaters in the 1990s. I could probably list them off if I wanted to, but like, yeah, it was fewer than 10. But we had a video store that was slightly closer. It was still like a 20-minute drive to get to the nearest video store, but that was the treat for me, you know. So when my mom would go into town to go grocery shopping, I would break off while she was doing that, because most supermarkets had their own video store built into the supermarket back in those days. And I would just wander the aisles and read every box, you know. So that's kind of how I was absorbing everything. And like, I was finally, we got cable TV in like 1996, and that's when I finally got to start catching up on like MTV and like stuff like that. So
oh my God, you have so many years of MTV's The Grind to catch up on.
Right? Yeah, I missed out on like Yo MTV Raps and like Headbangers Ball. I missed out on all of those
120 minutes.
I would catch glimpses of it when I would like stay at a friend's house for sleepovers, you know, like we would sneak and watch Beavis and Butthead or Aeon Flux and like, you know, hope that we wouldn't get busted for it. But so video stores became a real treat for me, and it became a real kind of escape, because as much as my parents were trying to build this woodsy kind of atmosphere into me, it did not take. I hated living in the woods. I hate camping. I hate hiking. I hate all of that stuff.
Ditto.
maybe it's just kind of a contrarian nature of my upbringing, but like I give me a city any day of the week, you know. And so that was just kind of my way of connecting with like the wider world, you know. Like I got to engage in culture through movies and through music and eventually through like MTV and cable shows. Yeah.
So it's so funny because it's a total 180 in terms of upbringing. We ended up in the same place, but the route we took, you know, we're a little different. I will say, you mentioned before about soundtracks, and I would be remiss if I didn't say that a really formative one for me, because I'm a man of a certain age, was the soundtrack to the movie Singles.
Oh yeah, that was a big one. That was a big
That
one.
was a big one too, because, you know, like other people my age, I listened to, I was lucky that I had parents who listened to, for the most part, pretty modern music. Like through the 80s, their tastes shifted a little bit too. And I'll talk more about my parents in a moment. But like, you know, they would play, as it got into the mid 80s, they got more into, you know, they would play New Order and Depeche Mode and stuff like that, and the Smiths and the Cure. And that was then kind of stuff that I was hearing a lot. And then because of my mom's cousin, RIP, recently passed away only about a few months ago.
Oh, I'm sorry.
He was the person who really was the driving force in me finding, discovering, and consuming a lot of the kind of weird shit that I got into. Like, he was the person who, so a little backstory for him. He passed away about 5 months ago, at the age of 75. He was a New York City OG, in the sense that he was born. I mean, he lived other places around the world and country, but always kind of came back to New York for most of his life. He grew up in New York in the 50s and 60s. He was part of the Warhol scene.
Oh, wow.
I mean, he hung around with all of them. He is one of the people who is kind of in the periphery of a lot of the famous photographs of the March on Stonewall. He was there for it. And I mean, and he had a million wild stories of being a gay man growing up in New York City in the 1950s and 60s, into the 70s. I mean, you know, he would just tell us these wild things, and he had a lot of kind of B and C list celebrity friends who would kind of hang around. He was a jewelry designer. And he designed. He got very big in the 80s, designing things for Cher and Madonna.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, and then he went on to he stopped doing it for a while, and then around 2010 he got back into it again. And as this sort of retro costumey jewelry, he got kind of popular again, and all of a sudden his pieces were being worn in spreads by Miley Cyrus and the Kardashians and all of these people. And you know, he always was just this sort of amazing fringe personality. I mean that kind of in the best way possible.
Yeah.
And he was the person who bought me Michael Weldon's book, Psychotronic Video Guide. He was the person who, when I was like 10 years old, he was like, "Oh, you seem to like horror and stuff. Like, let's watch Blue Velvet." And then would introduce me to music too. I remember being like not 8 years old maybe, and he played for me Pixies and Jane's Addiction and stuff like that. And so I already had a proclivity towards liking kind of alternative REM too, like very early on. And it was like, oh, this is kind of college music, alternative music. And he would introduce me to a lot of bands that way. He also was the person who introduced me to a lot of like UK punk that wasn't the stuff my parents were still listening to in the late 80s. So he introduced me to like the Pistols and the Dead Boys and the Damned and stuff like that I wasn't actually finding out about on my own. And his influence was so huge. And to this day, like so much of the stuff that I'm into was because of him. And so his influence on just the and I think the show, and he was a fan of the show. He listened to the podcast in the
Oh,
remaining year and a half or so of his life.
well, that's nice to
Um,
hear.
I don't know if he heard every episode, but he would message me saying like, "Oh, I love that you're doing this," because he was like one of those. He was a cultivator of trash.
Hey,
He was like a disciple of John Waters in that way.
I
And
mean, aren't we all? Yeah. Like, yeah, that there you could definitely see. I mean, that is a lot of, I think, what we ended up doing on this show is just sort of like cultivating and celebrating trash, and I think, and we say that very affectionately. Like it's I have an affinity for the parts of pop culture that will otherwise just be left in the dustbin. And I'm not here to judge whether or not it should be left in the dustbin or not. I think it's fascinating. I have such great admiration for people who make movies because I know many people who do it, and I know how fucking hard it is on every single level, and how miraculous it is that there are any good movies at all, considering how difficult they are to make them. So like even the smaller projects, I think I want to have them shouted out. I want to have somebody like take it seriously for at least a little bit, and I think that's something I'm proud of that we do on this show at the very least. But it is funny that like, I was thinking about like your musical influences and all of that, and I was thinking like I don't think I took one single influence from my parents' musical tastes. Like, again, maybe I'm being contrarian, but I don't think I took it. But maybe it's also because my mom listened to like her favorite artists are Barbara Streisand, Santana, and Peruvian pan flute music that she bought at a gift store once. So like my parents were all, I mean, still are. They're almost kind of aggressively tuned out to the culture. They just don't want anything to do with like media or pop culture, or just kind of like the greater world outside of their own very personal little bubble. So they found a couple of artists that they liked when they were very young, and then they never really continued to explore or branch out.
well, I feel like that's true of a lot of people. Like I
Yeah,
have friends my age who don't really have strong music tastes because they didn't really grow up in houses where music was championed that way. And then they don't really go out of their way to discover anything. They're kind of fine with a little bit of music they hear on the radio, and they might like a song or like an artist or buy an album from time to time.
yeah,
But to me, it's like media in that sense, and I'll throw books into this too.
yeah,
Although books can be its own separate part of the conversation, but like media in that way, if we're talking movies, we're talking music, we're talking literature, is so integral to me. It's not background stuff. Like I'm a real stickler for certain things. Like when I am out and about, I generally, if I'm shopping, if I'm by myself, I generally have my earbuds in.
yeah. Me too.
And when I commute on the subway or on the bus, I have my earbuds in. And I generally, I don't really find myself often in situations where I'm consuming music that's being curated by someone else. Like
Yeah,
I'm very picky about, this is what I want to hear, this is what I want to listen to. I mean, if a friend offers me a ride and they just have the radio on, I'm not going to complain about it, but
no,
it's not the way that I would never turn or just put a radio station on, because
yeah, yeah,
that's just not the way I operate. Just like, seeking out these movies for the show is kind of like us making an attempt, like, okay, like I don't want to talk about just any movie like you mentioned earlier. I want to talk about these ones because these ones are ones that, if they're not explored, or they're not kind of picked up and dusted off, they could definitely easily be forgotten to time.
yeah,
And you made an interesting point before, Steve, when you said like you want to kind of pick these movies up out of the dustbin, and then it's not for you to decide whether or not they stay there.
yeah,
How this show started, I was thinking about this the other day because I've sort of told the story of the beginning of the show where it was like you and I were podcasting together.
yeah,
In
yeah,
conversation, we said we both read It Came from the Video Aisle. It then turned into kind of a joke, like, hey, has anyone ever covered all of these movies? Because there's so many of them.
yeah,
And
yeah,
then it progressed from there. But where I think idea really started was JR, who we were podcasting with on Talking Terrific Television, had expressed interest in wanting to do a show where we basically researched what are the like considered to be like the 500 worst pieces of media,
Oh,
like
sure. Yeah.
worst television show episodes, worst movies, things like that. And then we were going to like watch them and roundtable and decide like, is this unfairly maligned? Does this
Right.
have merit? Like, is there something you can and some pleasure you can mine from this thing, or is it complete trash?
Right.
And that idea for that concept of a podcast floated around really briefly. But then I think once we started having our side conversations about Full Moon, and then it was like we knew Confessions of a Puppet Master was coming out.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
like, I feel like it needs to gravitate this way. Like, I feel like we need to. And then again, yeah, it started, has anyone done Full Moon? And I remember I looked and there was one podcast that was a mission statement. We're going to watch every Full Moon feature. I think the show went 4 episodes and the last one had been published like 2 years prior.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, okay, so this isn't really a market that has been saturated, to say
Yeah.
the least. But then because so much of the stuff is obscure, it was kind of like, all right, well, we can keep it as Full Moon. I know when we our concepts for our artwork and stuff say Full Moon features, but it was like, it needs to be Full Moon and Empire because we need
Yeah.
to talk about Reanimator and From Beyond and Ghoulies and all of these things that are kind of really synonymous with Charles Band and Trancers and stuff like that. But then it was like, okay, but then what about Tourist Trap and what about Laser Blast? Okay, so we'll just do Charles Band, and then he also has his hands in so many other cookie jars of things
Right.
that it was just like, this seems like the natural premise for the show. And so that was really how it started. It was like, let's kind of examine some of what people would consider to be the bottom of the barrel. And I think once we got started with our mission statement, you know, our first few episodes admittedly are a little bit harsh in the sense where I feel like we're definitely more critical
Yeah.
of things. But obviously the show has grown and the show has evolved, and we've built relationships now with people who were involved in these projects, and we have a lot of goodwill towards them, and we've got a lot of stories and perspective on, you know, how difficult it might have been to even get this movie made with the budget and time constraints. And I think, you know, the easy route would be, you watch this movie, you come on the podcast for an hour and talk about how shitty it is.
Yeah.
And we didn't really want to do that. And I feel like we would have ended up probably being very charitable with things we talked about on that other podcast, had that come to fruition.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I don't know. Your definition of like a bad movie really varies for a lot of people. And I think my definition just has evolved a lot just since we've been doing this show, because I think subconsciously I've just been kind of putting like Full Moon movies in their own bucket, you know, and you have to kind of think about, I'm not comparing this movie to The Brutalist. I am comparing this movie to the Ginger Dead Man 1, you know, like what, like I am, you develop your own kind of criteria for what makes a good movie and what makes a bad movie. And you do have a lot of affection for it. I find I'm going to cut a lot of slack to movies of this ilk because they were made fast and cheap and for almost no money, and oftentimes with like unskilled people who are just kind of like cutting their teeth and like learning their craft. And that's so super valuable. I mean, for me, the only movies that really the movies that really get under my skin and really make me upset and really piss me off are the ones that are corporated to death. You know, they're run through a boardroom so many times that the soul has basically been like wrung out of this thing. You know, you'll get like a $200-300 million movie that just has nothing to say and no thought or care or anything beyond like dollar signs put into it. That's become the era of the type of movie that I just like cannot stand. You know, I would
sadly, the direction things seem to be going. I mean, it feels like these kind of corporate executive clipboard legacy sequels are the way a lot of these franchises are headed. I mean, I don't know that I talked about it on the show, but if you follow me personally on social media, you've probably seen me post about it before. I really genuinely disliked Alien Romulus. And the reason was not because it was a poorly made movie.
Yeah.
Wasn't because the performances were bad or it looked like shit or anything like that, or there weren't some cool xenomorph effects or even a couple of decently effective sequences. What I couldn't stand about the movie was the relentless fan service and kind of executive studio overseeing of everything. Like I felt like Fede Alvarez was brought on because he had a voice and he had a style. And I felt like by the time the finished product was on screen, he had sort of been neutered with what he was able to do. And I don't think the movie that we saw is the movie he wanted to make. And I think that comes across in the way that he's promoted the movie, the way he's talked about it too. And I feel like I get why they're compelled to do that. Like hire somebody who's kind of exciting and might bring, because they wanted a horror forward kind of back to basics, goopy, bloody alien movie. And there's moments where they got it.
Yeah.
But then there's just some stupid shit like, I mean, not even talking about the biggest, most egregious blunder of all, the deep fake Ian Holm for no reason at all.
That should just be illegal at this point. Like, no more of that. Come on. That ruins a movie for me.
Right. But it's like all of the female characters have to be Ripley prototypes from different periods. Like Ripley has to be wearing like a combination of her coveralls and her Reebok sneakers from Aliens. And it's like that kind of stuff. It doesn't, like, who cares? Like, just tell a new alien story. We love the designs.
Yeah.
Big Eager designs, xenomorphs, face huggers, like keep those designs, but just, if you're going to go back to basics as if you're not trying to remind people of existing properties. And it's unfortunately a tightrope walk that a lot of these studios haven't mastered.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's what they're going to continue to do because they make money. I have not seen Rise of Skywalker, but that's what I've heard is the same thing.
I was going to bring that. I mean, Romulus has bits of that. It's not as like that one. That didn't bump against. I didn't bump against it as much as you did on that movie. I still think that movie's like okay at best. But Rise of the Skywalker is the movie that is the most egregious example of that for me. And that's why I kind of consider that my least favorite movie ever made, because I am a big Star Wars fan. And this is moving the series in a direction of empty, mindless fan service. This is literally like, this feels like they went to the most toxic element of the internet. They gave them a checklist of things that they would want to see in their Star Wars movie. And it didn't matter that it negated any of the threads that Rian Johnson or even J.J. Abrams himself was setting up prior to this. They had all kinds of things in motion. Mm-hmm. This just stops all of that in its path to make it be about the same bullshit over and over again, and just to appease the most toxic element of the fandom. And that's the kind of shit that kills art to me, when you're giving people exactly what they think they want instead of what they need. Yeah. So that's where I come down on that. But I mean, I've been going on far too many Star Wars rants lately. We've been doing the Star Wars series over at
Cinema Arcade is on Star Wars now, right?
There's been a lot of spicy Star Wars takes going through my brain right now. So, but yeah,
they're probably not spicy to me. If I'm being
probably
honest.
not
Like that.
Yeah. So you're largely indifferent to the Star Wars universe. I've been having a weird kind of resurgence in my Star Wars fandom recently. I think partially just doing the Cinema Arcade series. I'm just like, yeah, these are really hitting the spot for me. These are reminding me of what I know. And a core part of being a Star Wars fan is hating Star Wars. So, you need to kind of square those two things, in your own way. But yeah.
But yeah, that's I thought this would be just kind of a nice thing to do, because I think one of the things about listening to podcasts is sometimes you're listening for information.
Yeah.
Sometimes you're listening solely for entertainment. But I felt like a hallmark of some of the shows that I've enjoyed listening to the most is when you kind of you put it on and you just kind of feel like the people you're listening to.
Yeah.
And I think you can still be informed by it, but I think, like, we obviously want to let our guests talk. I mean, we
Yeah.
obviously drive the conversation, and we may come in with questions, talking points, stuff like that. But I think for something like this is kind of important to have a forum to say some of these things, because some of these kind of tangents or origin stories or side stories or musings, they would come at the expense of one of our episodes, and we try to be pretty compactful with time. We don't really want them to go over an hour 10 generally. And if we go on tangents enough, and so I thought it would be good if we devoted just an episode to this. I do want to ask you though, Steve, two things.
Okay.
One, so we are nearing episode 100.
We are.
So when this drops, we will have probably just started teaser posts for episodes like 95 through 100 or so.
Yeah.
Probably our recording, our episode releases, I should say, for like February, March, or mid-February into March. So 100 that's a nice big round number. I like to think of that as a milestone. We haven't missed a week.
We have not.
We've been on. I'm knocking on wood on my desk right now. We have not, and we've managed to drop some of these bonus episodes on Tuesdays too. So even some of the week we dropped 2 episodes for you guys. Do you have a highlight so far? So looking back on, we've recorded essentially all 100 of the first episodes, essentially, just about. What has been a highlight for you to this point, outside of just maybe finding a couple of hidden treasures or discovering a movie you weren't too familiar with? Like, what's something that was a real surprise or really pleasant that maybe that you enjoyed more than you expected?
I think, just as a kind of general note about all of it, I think I have so thoroughly enjoyed getting to have all these cool people on our show, all these people who are really entrenched in the horror world. And I get to see kind of firsthand what it's been spoken about, and people, like, it's kind of tacitly understood by a lot of people within the horror community. But if you're on the outside of it, and you may not realize that, like, the people in the horror community are some of the nicest human beings you will ever meet in your life.
Sure are.
They're sweet, they're self-effacing, they're easy to work with and easy to talk to, and that's been true pretty much across the board with every guest that we've had on this show so far. And that's just really cool to see, because it is a genre that is so soaked in gore and nihilism and violence and fear and all these other things, but everybody you talk to is just like a big teddy bear, which has been incredible. I've loved getting to speak with people who have been in the industry, like on either side of the camera. I think talking to Denise Duff and Kevin Spiritus was definitely a highlight for me, just because I loved watching those two go. I love they've got these huge, like, vibrant personalities that were just a lot of fun to dig into. But yeah, I think that's been kind of the biggest thing. Like, I don't get to go to a lot of, like, horror-centric events. I don't get to do a lot of things like that, or really get out into the community. I'm also a pretty introverted, shy, awkward person in a lot of ways. So, like, it's not as easy for me to put myself out there and, like, meet people. Like, I suspect you have less issue with that than I do. Maybe to a degree, but, like, yeah. But yeah, I mean, we've gotten to really meet some cool people, including Barbara Crampton, who's coming up pretty soon. We've had an amazing conversation with her. She was so cool. And all these just awesome people who got to actually make this stuff. And nobody's, like, embittered about it. Nobody is these are not you might watch a movie like Evil Bong or something like that, or Ouija's or Ginger Dead Man. You might think, okay, well, the people who make these are just idiots or something like that, or they don't have it. No, everybody who's been involved in these movies is in on the joke. They know what they're doing. They are very smart people who are very capable and very good at what they do. But they're in on the joke, and they know what they're there for, and they know what
occasionally, sometimes we just don't like the joke.
Occasionally, look, and that, hey, look, we reserve that right, and everybody does, and some of the people there that have been involved in it don't like some of the movies that they've been involved in, and that's all right. But that's been kind of the big highlight for me, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, obviously, getting Barbara Crampton on the show to talk about Reanimator was amazing. Just so generous with her time.
Yeah.
And Michael Gingold for coming on and sort of, facilitating and getting involved too. And like people like Michael and Phil Nobile, who are just, mainstays of any horror docs that you see, having them on here, talking to us, treating our little show as if it's, a horror's best for Shudder or something like that.
Right.
That kind of thing about it is great. And I would say, yeah, like to me, one of my favorite things so far was having Jeffrey Byron on for the Dungeon Master.
Yeah, Jeffrey.
Because it was really interesting to get an actor's perspective. And I remember going into that episode a little nervous because it was like, okay, do I have to watch what I say? Because if I make any comments about performance or anything, like he's the lead of this movie.
Yeah.
Like when we had some of our other interviews, we were doing more career retrospective stuff. So for this one, it was kind of like, oh, we're talking to him. We're talking about this movie. And I remember wondering if it was going to get awkward at all during the conversation. And it couldn't have been further from that. Just
not at all. Yeah.
Lovely person. So happy to be talking about this obscure movie that he made 40 years ago.
Yeah.
And it, that's been the thing too, is people have been, I think I've said this before. I really thought when we started the show that Steve and I would have these conversations. Maybe occasionally a friend of ours would want to come on to be a guest.
Yeah.
But really it would just be us, and we'd be kind of like talking about these movies and maybe finding stuff we liked, stuff we didn't like. And the episodes would run 45 minutes probably, and we would be banging them out weekly, trying to make our way through the entire Charles Band filmography.
Yeah.
Kind of falling on deaf ears, maybe getting downloaded by a handful of people, and then forcing our immediate family and close friends to pity listen to the episodes. And the fact that reaching out to people and telling them this is what we're doing for the show, this is the theme, and them being just so enthusiastic about getting involved with the show, is really been probably one of the most rewarding parts. Like reaching out to somebody who was the effects person on a movie and saying, we're going to talk about this movie. Would you want to come on and have a conversation? I was never really met with like, no, thanks, I'm not interested in doing that.
Yeah.
Like, I did, there are some people who have titles within the horror community where they deal kind of in more, for lack of a better term, like highbrow stuff, who might have said to me like, oh, like that sounds fun, but I don't really know any Charles Band stuff. And like, I don't know if that's my wheelhouse. And they did. And so, we could always kind of maybe convince a few of them to do a spin the wheel and go in completely blind and see how it goes. But as it pertains to people involved, everyone's been really happy and gracious to come on and talk about these things, and to that we're unearthing them, and that we're asking questions about them, and that we're bringing them on for this, because a lot of them are still working within low budgets, whether it's for Full Moon or other low budget companies. Just that's probably been the best part, was sending out casting the first net to guests and expecting to get radio silence.
Yeah.
And then instead being met with like, sure, sounds fun, let's do it. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, great. Count me in. And before that, that's why we went from no guests to guests every week so quickly, was because
people were willing to talk about it.
Every person I was casting the net to was like, yeah, sure. And I mean, and there's probably been even people I corresponded with who our correspondence has kind of faded over the last year and a half, who were interested and then I lost touch or forgot or something like that. So
We'll
it's just
circle
been a
back. Yeah.
really fun, rewarding experience as we hit 100 movies. And my one last question I have for you, Steve, is has your number one changed?
Has my number one changed?
So we
Technically,
did a ranking on our 50th or I'm sorry, we did a ranking around episode 45 or so, which was for the first 50 movies
yeah,
that we watched, and we're well over 100 movies now as
yeah.
we near episode 100, because some have been doubled or even tripled up. But
I have not updated my part of the spreadsheet, I think, since we did the last like recap episode, but it's technically my number one has changed, but it's just changed into kind of what we always knew would be number one.
Sure.
In that we have now watched Reanimator. And Reanimator was always going to be my number one. Like I really thought like From Beyond was the current number one. And I think there was a thought that like, oh, is this going to usurp it for me? And then I rewatched Reanimator. I'm just like, no, this one is still rock solid, perfect, and it's my number one with the bullet. And there was never really any tension for me that would be the number one. I think I'm more excited to see like, what's my number 5 gonna be? Like, what's the top 10 gonna shake out to be like when we're all done with it? And that one I think is gonna have room for a lot of surprises.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I have not gone back to the spreadsheet to update it, but I will say that Reanimator is my number one right now of the 115 or however many movies we've watched so far for the show.
Yeah.
That falls squarely on number one, which was never really in question. I mean, if you know me, you know that outside of even this show, Reanimator is a top 5 movie for me. It's been that way for 20 something years. And we talk about that. This is probably as good a place as any to end this little get to know you between the two of us.
Well, I did want to throw
go ahead,
out
Steve.
One actual significant life event that I wanted to debut on this episode, both to you and to the listeners. I figure this is a getting to know you episode. Might as well be this is as good a time as any to let people know. I am getting married. I'm engaged to my girlfriend Ailish. We've been dating for about 2.5 years now.
Oh, congratulations, man!
As of New Year's Eve, we are engaged. We're getting married sometime. We don't know when yet exactly, but that's a big scoop for everybody. A big reveal. Yeah, I'm engaged now.
So and in case you're wondering why, like, I'm finding out for the first time now, and Steve said the phrase "as of New Year's Eve." We're recording this very fresh in the new year.
So we are very fresh in the new year, and it is. I was saving it to debut it on the show and get a live reaction. So yeah, we're very excited. That's a big new development on my side. But yeah, that's one thing you need to know to get to know me right there.
Well, welcome to the club. That's really exciting, and I'm sure once our listeners hear that, you will get an outpouring of praise and support and congratulations from all of them.
And gift cards, I assume. Come on, people.
Yes,
and then gift cards.
Monetary value.
I need Sephora.
I think, this is kind of a good place to end the show, because in a few weeks from now, you will hear that Reanimator episode, which is episode 100 of the show. It was recorded already a few weeks back. We did it very early. You'll even hear Barbara Crampton give us accolades for being the very first people to contact her about any Reanimator anniversary stuff. to fully date it clearly in 2024.
Yeah, I'm like, she's got this whole year of Reanimator stuff, and technically we were the first one, but people have beaten us to it by a couple months at this point. But
mid-March, you'll hear that episode. But we also, we have some other really fantastic episodes coming up on Crypt, Ginger Dead Man 3, and Crips and Dragon World before that. So a lot of fun stuff leading us into episode 100. So for all of you who have either jumped in at some point and kind of stuck with the show and are maybe working your way back through the catalog, thank you. Everyone who's been with us from the very beginning, following us on this journey, thank you guys so much for all of your support. A lot of really great fan interaction and feedback and stuff like that. So so happy to be doing this, and episode 100 will hit mid-March. And because we're dealing with Charles Band, we will have easily 3 to 4 more hundred to go.
Yeah, yeah. It's we'll I don't think we'll ever fully get caught up, but we'll do our best.
All right. Well, thank you guys for tuning in to our Get to Know You bonus episode. Steve, congratulations again on
Thank you
you
so
and
much.
Alicia's engagement. That's very exciting news.
Thank you so
And
much.
we will see all of you guys this Friday for Ginger Dead Man 3 Saturday Night Cleaver.
Hell yeah.